He looked asleep, sprawled in a burgundy velvet armchair, one hand slack on the arm, the other resting on a book he had closed more from habit than interest. Rain spattered the tall library windows in a steady, restless percussion. The brass clock on the mantel clicked the minutes like distant, patient footsteps. On the low table beside him, where it could be seen by anyone who walked in, lay an envelope, thick enough to make the paper bow, a neat, crisp $5,000 inside. The light from the fireplace painted everything gold and false. Gold on the leather-bound spines, gold on the polished floor. Outside, thunder rolled, indifferent. Arthur Sterling breathed slowly, eyes hidden beneath a hairline of closed lids. He was not sleeping. He had set himself into the armchair as carefully as a man takes a place behind a one-way mirror. The velvet cupped around him like an altar. The envelope sat where temptation could be measured in ounces and in the human heart. He had done this many times before, variations on the same experiment. Leave something valuable where another's hand might find it, and simply wait. He called it verification. Others might have called it paranoia. To Arthur, it was protection, a small, private ritual sharpened by years of betrayals that had hollowed his trust until it echoed. He had the time tonight. There was a storm. The house staff were down to a whisper. Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen, a single maid in the wing. They were competent. They were discreet. Sarah, the new woman hired to come on in the week after an upper-floor boiler had busted, had turned up soaked and exhausted, and Arthur allowed her to stay. She had two things about her that unsettled him in equal measure. She was loud in her worry, and she carried a child. The boy sat on the rug by the fire, small knees tucked under, a puddle of damp on the cuff of his jacket. He had dark, honest eyes and a toy car that had seen better afternoons. Tape held its rear bumper, and one wheel had a crooked shine like a coin flattened by too many small palms. To the boy, it was the whole of a vanished father's pleasures compacted into something he could clutch. To Arthur, it was detritus. And yet, even as he tightened his jaw against the memory of what people would do for money, he watched the toy with suspicion, as though it might conspire. Arthur had arranged everything not to catch a thief. He already knew thieves existed in suits, but to prove a hypothesis he had rehearsed like a litany. Generosity exposed the weak. Generosity invited taking. Leave money unattended. See who reaches. Measure. If the experiment asked for a moral calculus of human nature, he would be the man to brute force the data. A soft draft came when Sarah closed the door. She had protested at first. She could not possibly leave the child alone, and Arthur had, with a mechanical civility, brushed those concerns aside.
He had seen the way the storm pressed at people that evening, the way it made them cling to small comforts. He wanted to know which kind of creature Leo was. He wanted to know whether a child taught to survive will steal comfort from a sleeping man. Mrs. Sterling? The idea of that courtesy title, unused in his own mouth, sounded foreign and dangerous. He had no wife now, only the memory of a woman who had chosen the part of his wealth that suited her more than the man beside it. Men who loved him in years past had loved his money before his grief. Partners had offered knives behind the smiles, contracts signed with elastic hands. That pattern had left him sterile of trust. He had sworn to himself not to be vulnerable again, and so he was careful. He made people prove themselves, as if character could be compounded like raw metals in a crucible. The radiator hissed. Mrs. Higgins's muffled footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Sarah's door closed with a soft click. Arthur let himself slow. He breathed in the oak-scented air and became the chair. He listened to the clock. If you're the sort of person who stays for a story that keeps its promise, if you like twists that feel earned, hit like and stick around. This is one of those you won't want to miss. When Sarah left, she kissed Leo on top of his head in a dry, frightened motion. "Stay where I can see you," she whispered. Her voice trembled but carried a steel line through it. She was selling safety on credit. "Don't answer the door for anyone, okay? Not for a minute. I'm right next door. Just—" Her knuckles lingered on the doorknob as if timing a return. Leo nodded. He was 7, all knobby elbows and a persistent thrift store bravado. He swallowed, heart, because some fears are swallowed in order to be useful. "Okay, Mama," he said. The hallway took Sarah's footsteps away. The library felt suddenly louder for the absence of adult voices, the crack of firewood, the hearth's soft presence like a slow heartbeat. Leo placed his toy by his knee as if it were a talisman. Up close, you could see the craftsmanship of small hands, little gouges where he had once shaved varnish with a hobby knife, a smear of blue paint that had never truly left its surface. Across the roof of the car, someone had written in a child's clumsy script, "Fast Eddie." The name squared the small object into history. His father had called it that once in a story. Leo spoke the name sometimes like a prayer. He moved like a child does when duty threatens, with careful, precise motions that betray the enormity of what they mean to hold myself responsible for. The jacket Sarah had shrugged off lay draped over the arm of another chair, still wet from the weather, steam lifting from the fabric where her shoulders had been. Arthur had watched women peel their outer lives away so many evenings he could have told you where the salt from the sea had pooled on a coat. He had watched hands tremble reaching into pockets.
Tonight, his eyes stung with something older, an accumulation of disappointments like barnacles. He watched, measuring. Leo was the sort of child who had learned the economy of gentleness. He didn't approach the sleeping man with the greedy sort of curiosity one sees in other children, where value is a map and every pocket a possible treasure. He looked at Arthur with a studious kindness, as if reading instructions for an unfamiliar instrument. The boy's small fingers moved to the jacket draped over the chair, then hesitated. Rain had dampened the cloth. It clung to a child's skin in a way that smelled of summer storms. He set it near Arthur's shoulder and tucked the sleeve around the sleeper's arm, careful with that ritual intimacy you use with people you love. Arthur felt the movement before he felt conscience. He watched the jacket settle, the way the damp fabric darkened the velvet where it touched, the steam rising in lazy spirals into the warm air. That act cracked him open in a place he had kept shuttered. He had expected stealth, not care. He had expected fingers rifling for envelopes, not tucking. The envelope was the reason he'd left the money on the table. He had wanted to see the arithmetic of temptation, hunger versus habit, need versus greed. But Leo did something else. He noticed that a small notebook had fallen from Arthur's lap when the book snapped shut. Leo picked it up and smoothed the bent corner with that same reverence. The notebook was nothing to anyone else. A ledger of petty reminders, a grocery list, a map of things Arthur needed to forget. To the boy, it was a task, right the wrong. He shoved it into a stack beside the money, lined up the edges like hands at prayer. Arthur's chest narrowed, his hands, hidden in the velvet, tightened. He felt absurdly proud and oddly exposed at the same time. He had not expected this. He had expected the pocketing of money, the sullen scramble of those who had been taught to take first and answer later. In every scenario he had rehearsed, advantage had chosen its usual apprentices. Tonight, the boy had chosen warmth. A minute passed as a single breath. Arthur listened to the clock. He felt flayed by something like shame. It was not the shame of being proved wrong. He had been wrong 100 times. It was the deeper, stranger shame of having plotted a small test that pretended to be science, when it was, at base, a way to hurt people to justify a pre-existing hurt in himself. Leo, who understood storms in the bone and had patience like a script learned through repetition, did one more thing. He stepped forward on his knees and, with deliberation that belied his age, took the envelope and laid it on the arm of the chair where Arthur's hand might reach it, where it would be obvious if anyone moved it. Then he pushed it further into the crease of the cushion, as if making sure it would not slide away. He did not put the money in his pocket. He did not slide it under the rug.
He placed it where honesty and prudence met, not hidden, not stolen. The motion was small. It was everything. Arthur's heartbeat was a new, intrusive thing. He wanted to stand up. He thought about standing up. Instead, he kept his face tucked, eyes still shadowed. He had the luxury of watchfulness. The man who had once dismissed employees for asking too many questions was now learning what a child's small decisions could do to a life. Then Sarah came back. She had been no more than a minute next door, tugging a towel from the radiator in a clumsy attempt to dry the cuffs of her sleeves. Her breath left her when she opened the library door. The sight of her damp jacket thrown over a chair, the envelope on the table, the child's small body on the rug. She stopped short in the doorway, hand pressed to her chest as if to steady a sudden sharp concern. Her eyes found Leo. They were quick to find Arthur, too, the jacket across his shoulders, the money within reach, and the air between her and the scene trembled with an accusation she did not voice. "Oh my God," she breathed. Panic kindled where Sarah had left an ember of fear.
It was the kind of panic that explains itself with the math of immediate loss. One ripped-off coat could mean fewer loans covered. A single rumor could go further than hunger. She moved, not like a woman who had already learned how to rear a child through scarcity, but like someone who could not yet afford new mistakes. Her hands went to the wet cloth, fingers fluttering as if to reclaim it, to cover the child, to right what she assumed had been wronged. Arthur felt the panic hit the room and decided, with a neat cruelty born of calculation, to add weight to what had been a near accident of kindness. He let his lids lift on a slow axle and let the world fold back into sight. He let the composer of the night watch the next note soar. He opened his eyes fully and made a sound that was more of a gathering of breath than a word. "What is this?" he said, voice thin at the edges, but producing all the chilling control of a bell. It was a performance. He had rehearsed many times how to sound wronged. Sarah flinched. Leo looked up, a child's mouth rounding into the quick fear of being caught. Arthur set the ledger back onto his lap and let his disillusioned intent land. "You've stained my chair," he told Sarah. There was no need for evidence. He could invent the rest with surgical ease. He let his voice harden into anger because he wanted to see what the heat would reveal. "Do you know what that costs? $500 to repair velvet. That is the estimate." Sarah's face collapsed into something frantic. "Sir, She stopped, as if someone had pressed her palms to her eyes. Her shoulders dropped. She looked like someone who had been waiting all day for a miracle and had no hiding place. 500, Arthur repeated, letting the sum play like a metronome.
He set his jaw and allowed the cruelty, this manufactured, almost scientific cruelty, to do its work. "You will pay, or you will do what you promised when you took this job. You will make good." He watched the arithmetic unfold on Sarah's face, 1,000 worries, the possibility of losing a job, the small dignity of being unable to make restitution for an ember of damage in a rich man's furniture. Mrs. Higgins's footsteps paused outside, then retreated. The house was compressed into its immediate, horrific present, a mother's fear, a child's bewilderment, an employer's cold rhetoric. Sarah's hands came up to her mouth. She was mouthing pleas she could not afford to say aloud. "I'm sorry," she said, in a voice that sought negotiation. "I will fix it. I'll pay you back. I can—" Arthur had rehearsed this note too. He watched the calculations crossing her face, counting the ways she might sell herself down until she proved useful again. He had the taste now of everything money could buy, and none of the trust that once made it worth keeping. He allowed himself the small, merciless satisfaction of being believed by his own certainty. "No need," he said, and the words were designed to feel like a release and not a magnanimity. "We will see how loyal you are." He let his eyes flick to Leo. "If there is anything you are hiding—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The threat was a thin strand that would snap the smallness of a mother into confession. He wanted to see whether Sarah would bear the cost alone, whether she would, to preserve herself, point to her child and cast off responsibility. The room held its breath. Sarah stepped between the boy and the chair, as if the small body were already a shield, and she had become the sword. "No," she said, short and raw. "No, I would never take from you, sir." Her voice slid into a plea. "Please, we only—" Arthur let the pause sit like a line of barbed wire. He wanted confession. He wanted to know where loyalty lay. He wanted to see if she would sell Leo's possessions to pay for a chair she had no means to fix without forfeiting food. He wanted to learn whether sheer need would turn to accusation. Leo's eyes were enormous in the candle gold light. He had watched his mother wring hands on a kitchen table, seen letters with numbers that did not add up, listened to the hush of late-night calculations when there wasn't enough. He understood, at a boy's level, that money could move like weather, and that your small things were sometimes all you had to offer. His fingers went to his pocket, where the little car sat wrapped in an old paper towel. He hid it there like contraband, and then unleashed it the way someone unbuttons a secret. "Leo," his mother breathed, a tiny command meant to stop the child's movement before it started. "Promise," Leo said, to prove he was not a thief, but rather a deliberate actor in a drama too big for him. He stepped forward, toy held in both palms as though presenting a holy relic. "I can—" His voice found an adult steadiness by accident. "I can give this. I can pay the 500. It should have been ridiculous. A battered plastic car could not pay anything of consequence. But what Leo offered was not cold currency. It was the metric of a child's bravery. He pushed forward, and the toy caught the firelight, shifting its shabby paint into something almost golden. It was still embossed with Fast Eddie, the letters rubbed but legible, like a signature. Arthur's breath left him. There are things a man does not expect: a confession of theft, a child's bargaining with a toy. There are things that pierce the calculus no test was designed to hurt. For Arthur, there was a small, impossible memory that rose like steam from a long-closed pot, the smell of engine oil and afternoon sunlight, the time when a small hand had once matched him in stubbornness and laughter. He had once held a little boy like this and believed in presumed loyalties that lasted beyond contracts and ledgers. That child had a name that tasted like summer and had been taken out of his life by choices that were both his and not his. The memory was not a full story, but a shard, and it had the power of a relic. He felt something stir along his jaw, a wetness he mistook for an eyelid's stray leak until it burned down into his throat. He had not anticipated the leak because men like Arthur plan for variables and exclude mirables. He had not accounted for the way sacrifice looks when it has no audience to applaud it, no customers to complain, no boardroom to debate its merits, just a small boy with a toy and the battered courage to offer it. Leo kept his hands out like an offering. His voice was tiny and earnest. "It's all I have of Dad," he said, and the sentence did not reach for pity so much as it opened a vein. "He made Fast Eddie. He said it would always bring us home." Sarah's mouth formed a sound that was between a laugh and a sob. She had no words that would fit both the protectiveness and the shame swelling her. She reached out. Her fingers trembled toward Leo's wrist, but she didn't stop him. She had the look of someone who knew what it meant to let a child do what he thought was right in a room where a man's distrust ballooned. Arthur watched the small car in the boy's palms like a truth that could not be bought. The toy was patched with tape in 2 places. Its once red paint was a geography of small scars. Someone had written Fast Eddie on the hood in a careful childish hand. One wheel spun with the loose, improbable grace of something that had been repaired more out of love than skill. It was ridiculous in any ledger's arithmetic. It was priceless where a heart is concerned. He had come to this evening planning to humiliate, to verify, to close a loop that hurt him less every time. He had intended to leave with confirmation.
Instead, the room had offered a different test: whether this man could be moved. Arthur felt a first treacherous tear form, small, solitary, and entirely out of scale with the theater of the moment. It slid hot down his cheek and shocked him with its existence. He had taught himself to accept no weakness. He had forged a shell of contempt and kept his grief under lock and key. Now, grief was a thing that someone else had resurrected, a name called again in a child's offering. He wanted to cough. He wanted to clear his throat and regain the necessary hardness. He wanted to test further, to make them prove in even larger currency. He had already prepared scenarios for every possible outcome: firings, excuses, resignations. He had a ledger full of penalties. He had a mind full of punishments and the ability to enact them. He had a long, patient roster of stereotyped human responses that had, until tonight, behaved predictably. But a small plastic car in small, earnest hands does something to predictable men. It reorders what is prioritized. It brings memory forward in a way theory cannot predict. Arthur sat very still. The fire popped once, as if startled by his stillness. The clock clicked. The house held its breath like a body listening for a single vital sign. "Take it," Arthur said finally, but the phrase came out fractured. He had meant to say nothing of the sort. He had meant to exact a confession. He had not meant to offer mercy. Leo's eyes widened, then shrank with the confusion of a child trying to keep faith with 2 contradictory worlds at once: guilt and forgiveness. Sarah's head snapped up, searching Arthur as if for a trick that might explain his softening. He found himself blinking rapidly. The wet on his cheek felt like salt. He had tasted defeat without intending to. "Please," Leo whispered, loath to be generous if the token he offered would merely be dismissed. He held the toy out as one might hold a votive. For the first time since he had closed himself down after the betrayals that had changed him, after the partner who had signed away half his trust, and the woman who had left with a contingent of his better years, Arthur felt a possibility he had not allowed himself to imagine.
It was not a blaze of revelation like the sudden clearing of a fog. It was smaller, a warm, dangerous leak of something he could not bar with contracts or cold checks. It was the beginning of a hinge. His hand, which until then had rested on the arm of the chair like a folded statement, twitched. He reached up as though to put his hand over his face, and instead it dropped back to his lap. He felt the shape of the envelope against his thigh like an accusation. The $5,000 was a thing that had a smell and a weight and an implication. He could gather the money, throw it on the table, and scold them until the moment they left was a memory they would replay as a cautionary tale.
He had scripted cruelty so many times that the act of inconsistency felt like an error in an algorithm. The rustling of the pages of his closed book sounded like the whisper of a jury. He thought he could manage this. He thought he would do what he had always done: test, then retreat, then add another layer of armor. But someone's small hand had offered him a story that did not belong to contracts. It was not a promise he had asked for. It arrived unbidden. The room felt too bright and too fragile all at once. Arthur's throat made a sound like a man trying to count his losses and finding only additions. He had not decided what to do. He had not concluded whether the test would continue. He had at first only wanted proof that he had been right all along. Now the proof had come, and it was not what he expected. He thought of Fast Eddie. He thought of a child's hand, calloused from curtain ropes, a child's hand that could be trusted to sweep up spilled milk rather than pocket the coin. Outside, a thunderclap rolled across the roof like an omen or a punctuation. Inside, the small toy sat between them, a device of plastic and tape and unfathomable freight. Arthur's breath caught. For a man who had measured loyalty with margins and penalties, the simplest movement had become the hardest choice. He inclined his head, and when he looked again, his eyes were clear in a way he had not permitted for years. He rose from the chair, the burgundy velvet sighing under him, and made a motion as if to reach for the child. The world narrowed to the tiny car and the small hands presenting it. The room, the rain, the clock, everything collected into that fragile second where one man could respond in ways that would echo for a lifetime. Arthur's hand hovered. He had rehearsed being cruel. He had not rehearsed being moved. A single tear fell clear and unannounced down his cheek. He felt raw and unbearably human, as if someone had opened the valve on a tank he had kept pressurized for decades. The toy caught the firelight and threw it back like a promise. Arthur realized he did not know how to accept such a thing without paying for it in some measure he had yet to calculate. He did not yet know whether the price he would ask would be punishment or grace. The room waited, his breath fogged in the small space between decision and action. He let the room watch him as if confession were a performance he had finally decided to abandon. The burgundy velvet creased beneath him as he rose slowly to his feet, the firelight catching the weary planes of his face. Rain thudded like a distant hand against the glass. He kept his voice low. The house had ears, and his pride had fewer. "I wasn't asleep," he said. The words were simple and thin as thread, but they unspooled everything. The envelope, the ledger, the careful cruelty he'd rehearsed.
He had meant the evening to be data, a little experiment to confirm the old equations he trusted. People take when given the chance. Those with less will grab more from those with more. He'd meant to watch, to validate the ledger of his life. Sarah sagged like something relieved of its greatest burden and then terrified all over again. Her shoulders rolled, the breath she had been holding left her in a shuddering exhale. Leo's hands dropped the small car into his lap as if to offer it back, and then, at the sight of Arthur's face, to clutch it tighter. "I'm sorry," Arthur added, and the apology was not smooth. It sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. He had practiced apologies before, on paper, in speeches, in pieces of private liturgy, but this one had the tremor of surprise. "I wanted to see. He stopped, because the why of it tasted like ash. He had wanted justification for his barbed solitude. Instead, he had found the thing he had tried to keep dead, a muscle for feeling. Sarah's eyes searched him. Where a moment before they'd been full of panic, now they were trying to place the shape of the man who had been an adversary and had, abruptly, become something else. "Sir," she said, voice small, "why would you—" "You ask why," Arthur replied, not flinching from the question though the room might have expected him to. "Because I have been hurt. Because I have let what people do to me define what everyone is. Because I thought—" He inhaled and let that thought fall away. It was a flimsy defense for an ugly test. For a second there was only the creak of the house and the tick of the mantel clock. Then Arthur moved with an economy that no ledger could measure. He crossed to the low table, picked up the envelope with a care that looked nearly reverent,
and placed it back where any hand could see it. He set $5,000 down, not as bait, but as restitution, and more, an offer that carried both practical weight and the weight of his own embarrassment. "This is for you," he said to Sarah, then turned to the boy. "And for him." He tapped the envelope and saw how the light glinted on Leo's eyes. The child, who had given up the only thing of his father's, watched now as if the world might be balanced back into place by the simple arithmetic of a man's change of heart. "No," Sarah whispered, as if refusing charity was the only dignity left to her. Arthur's laugh came soft, almost sheepish. "No, not charity, opportunity." He drew a breath that trembled with plans and impulses. "I will pay for the chair." The words landed between them like a promise and a penance. 500. Keep your job, and he glanced down at the toy in Leo's lap. "And keep him here, if you'll let me. I can help him with school. I can—" He searched for the terms a man like him knew best. Money, instruction, access. "I will set aside money for his education, and if you want work stable, Mrs. Higgins will show you what I expect. No one will fire you."
It was not the neat, immediate absolution of a man with no conscience. This was clumsy, a powerful man fumbling toward repair. Sarah made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a cry. She crossed, hands moving as if to rearrange a life that hadn't been asked for such mercy before. "Sir," she began, and then stopped because names felt raw. "We don't—" She looked at Leo as if to measure his opinion. He swallowed and peered up at them both with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Arthur surprised himself by asking, almost before he knew he wanted it, "What's his school like now? What does he like?" The question was half curiosity, half a plea for proximity. He wanted to know the arithmetic of a child he had watched across a rug, a boy whose small decisions had rearranged something in him. Leo answered without pretense. "I like reading about cars, and numbers, and building things." His voice brightened at the memory of afternoons with a screwdriver and a patient father who taught him how wheels fit onto axles. Arthur's hand went unconsciously to his own lap, where the closed book had been. The ledger mattered less now. He found himself offering what he had always measured, access. "Bring him to my study tomorrow," he said. "We'll arrange tutors. We'll set up a fund. But," he added, and the word came with the gravity of someone binding himself to a new kind of promise, "I want one thing." Sarah braced, certain that she would be asked for paperwork or an oath. "I want you to let me earn the favor," Arthur said. "If I err, if I fail, tell me. If I do right, tell me. I don't want this to be simply a purse thrown across a table." There was an honesty in that request that no money could buy. Sarah studied him, the exhaustion around her eyes softening with something like trust, then nodded once. "We'll do that," she said, "for Leo." They sealed it not with signatures, but with a gesture that felt more honest. Arthur reached out, and almost without thinking, placed a hand over Leo's small, calloused fingers. The boy flinched for the fraction of a second, and then did not pull away. That narrow contact, a palm meeting a smaller one across Fast Eddie and the envelope, felt like the first hinge of a repair. That night, Arthur could not return to his chair in quite the same way. The velvet smelled of steam and of a child's damp jacket, and the world seemed alarmingly less secure. He sat instead by the fire and watched through a new lens. Memory arrived in small, inconvenient fragments. The clumsy way he'd once tried to teach a small hand how to change a tire, the taste of engine oil and lemonade on a summer afternoon, a child's laughter like a bell. He had hardened against the world for reasons as real as loss, but something that had calcified was now melting under the warmth of a small sacrifice. Over the following months, the house changed in subtle ways. Arthur did not make a spectacle of his change. His changes were quieter.
He hired a tutor for Leo, a retired engineer with a patient laugh, and set aside a modest trust for the boy's schooling, quietly ensuring the money would be there when needed. He offered Sarah steady hours and better pay. He invited them into the rhythms of his house without fanfare, Sunday suppers where the table groaned under honest food, walks in the gardens where Arthur's long legs lagged to match a child's shorter stride, afternoons in the study where he taught Leo, at first, the simplest things about numbers, and later, how to ask hard questions about fairness. Leo's presence began to do what no amount of ledger entries or charity reports could. He taught Arthur how to see without suspicion, how to let a small kindness stand on its own, not as proof of a larger score to be settled. Arthur found himself listening to the boy's theories about engines and patience.
He found himself laughing in ways that did not feel rehearsed. The house, once a place of files and closed rooms, warmed in the way a library does when pages are turned by many hands. Arthur kept Fast Eddie. He set the toy on a high shelf near the mantel at first, a shrine he was not sure how to honor. Over time, it migrated, placed on the study table during lessons, slid into the pocket of a coat when they walked the gardens, sent home in Leo's backpack like any other small companion. Arthur had promised the boy and his mother that he would help, and he delivered with the cautious generosity of a man trying to repair not just bank accounts, but himself. There were setbacks. Trust, once broken, does not mend in a straight line. Arthur still fought urges to test and prove, especially on mornings when a board member's letter arrived or when a deal soured his mood. He would catch himself rehearsing small cruelties like old habits. Sometimes he would stiffen when a staff member asked a question he felt should have been obvious. But Leo's simple questions about why a wrench fits a bolt, about where a number goes in an equation, drew him back. The child had the rare talent to ask without suspicion, to be curious without an agenda. It was a balm. It was a mirror. Sarah watched the subtle shifts with a practical gratitude. She paid off a string of small debts and learned to sleep without tallying every sound. Her hands steadied in the kitchen, and Mrs. Higgins, who had seen more seasons than either of them, gave a slow, approving nod when she caught Arthur and Sarah speaking in the hall like neighbors, rather than defendant and patron. "He softens," she told Leo once, in a manner that admitted both surprise and relief. In time. 10 years altered their lives in the quiet increments of days. Leo grew into a tall, deliberate young man who kept the habit of patience his childhood had taught him.
His interests broadened from toy cars to engineering, and then to systems that mattered: public transit plans, affordable housing designs, the nuts and bolts of communities, rather than the neat lines of personal profit. Arthur watched that growth with a kind of stunned pride that cost him nothing he would not gladly pay. Their relationship took on a texture of permission and correction. Arthur would still correct in the way of a man who had worked with numbers all his life, precise, deliberate, but his corrections came with an attempt at tenderness. Leo, for his part, asked hard questions without malice and accepted blunt answers with the sort of humility adults rarely practice. Sarah remained the fulcrum between them, a mother who had feared skirts of charity and now accepted a partnership that felt like dignity rather than pity. A small ritual threaded the years: the burgundy velvet armchair. Arthur would sometimes sit there and watch Leo work on an engine part or a scale model. The chair, which had once been the throne of his suspicion, now bore the imprint of two lives overlapping. It remained a symbol, a place where ghosts and living things met. When Arthur's health finally began to decline, gradual, predictable, the sort of attrition that people in the oldest houses learned to expect, he met it with an odd equanimity. He had not become a saint. He had simply learned that a life can be adjusted like a machine, parts repaired, alignments corrected. He wrote letters, updated accounts, and made arrangements with the same meticulousness he had once applied to contracts. But there was a difference now. His last instructions had the texture of someone who had been taught a better arithmetic. They accounted for a boy's education, for a mother's security, and also for opportunities that would outlast his particular pride. When Arthur's funeral took place, it was not the spectacle some of his peers had imagined. The room smelled of polished wood and lilies, and the burgundy chair sat empty near the mantel, as it had many times, now a mute witness. People who had once circled his name in annual reports came to place small, formal condolences. They found, to their irritation or surprise, that the man they had measured by suit and signature had left a life not entirely predictable by the old indices. In a sunlit room where the house's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, gathered family and a hand-picked few, the will was read aloud. Arthur's biological children, Polly and James, sat with the tightness of those who expect line items and entitlement. They had always been practiced at the arithmetic of inheritance. A life, they thought, was a ledger, and a will a final inventory. They had rehearsed outrage at nothing yet, decided it was their due. Mr. Henderson spoke in his steady, unhurried cadence. He opened the legal envelope and began. There were bequests that catered to old friendships and to institutions Arthur had formerly supported.
There were instructions about the house and a note to Mrs. Higgins that included a sum for her continued care. Then Mr. Henderson turned a page, and a room which had been comfortably filled with polite murmurs tilted. "It is my wish," the lawyer read in Arthur's handwriting, clear, deliberate, "that certain things be entrusted not only with material security, but with the continued practice of the values that astonished me when I was least looking." He paused and looked up. "To Leo, Leonard Sterling, son of Sarah, should he accept, I leave my residence, funds sufficient for his continued education and work, and the sum necessary to begin an institute in his name dedicated to practical innovation for communities in need." There was a rustle like offended paper. Polly's hand gripped her program. James's jaw hardened. "What?" Polly hissed under her breath. "This is absurd." Mr. Henderson continued, the legal voice now carrying the moral weight of the document. "Arthur Sterling was a man who measured much and, in the end, chose differently. He writes here explicitly that he attributes his change of heart to a single act of courage by a 7-year-old boy who offered what little he had. He wished that act to be honored not as charity, but as a corrective to an accountant's logic." Sarah felt her throat constrict. Leo, who had become a man with a slow smile and the kind of hands that suggested patience more than haste, listened with an air that was neither triumph nor disbelief. He had long stopped expecting awards for doing what he felt was right. Polly rose before the room could set itself like concrete. This is outrageous," she said, voice tight. "He had children. He had responsibilities." Mr. Henderson raised a hand that called no quarrel. "The testator's wishes are explicit and legally sound," he replied. "The estate transfer is to be executed as written." James, always the blunt instrument, could not help but jeer. "He wasted his life on theatrics," he muttered, on a stunt." Arthur's portrait, which hung over the mantel, looked down on them with the inevitable stillness of the man who had chosen his final account. It was as if the man in the painting had decided to make the arithmetic of his life reflect the thing he now valued. After the reading, the children made noises about attorneys and appeals. They threatened, as practical people do when their expectations are unfulfilled, to contest. But Arthur had written with a thoroughness that made contest both costly and, as Mr. Henderson noted with a small, dry smile, unlikely to overturn the spirit of the document without great loss of public esteem. When the formalities wound down, Mr. Henderson handed a small wooden box to Leo. Inside, wrapped in tissue, rested Fast Eddie. It was not the chipped, patched thing that had been presented in a small palm 10 years ago. Someone had taken care, someone whom Arthur had trusted in life, to restore the toy with a tender hand.
One wheel was replaced by a new component carefully soldered into place. Where once the wheel had been a crooked coin of a shine, now a small brass wheel gleamed with the gentle luster of a kept promise. It was not a different car, but it bore the added mark of repair and of value. Leo lifted it with a quiet reverence. He turned it in his palm like someone reading a small private history. "He fixed it," Sarah said, voice soft. Tears had come now not from surprise, but from the settling of things into the place they should have been. Polly could not hide her disdain. "So the toy matters more than—" She broke off, because some things sound small even when they are large. Later, alone in the study, Leo placed Fast Eddie on the mantel near the spot where the burgundy chair sat empty. He ran his thumb along the brass wheel and thought of the night of the storm, of his mother's wet jacket, of a man who had posed as asleep to catch a heart in the act. He thought of the strange economy that had started in that room, the debt of kindness repaid many times over. The institute Arthur had left in trust bore Leo's name, and in its charter, an unusual clause that reflected the man who had written it. Funds were to be used not only for scholarship and research, but for stipends allowing young engineers and planners to work in neighborhoods that commercial metrics had long considered unprofitable. Arthur had meant to give his resources where he could no longer merely measure return on investment. He wanted, in the last account, to invest in human currency. Leo administered that gift with an uncommon humility. He hired teams of young innovators, many from the very neighborhoods that needed attention. He established programs that taught practical skills, wiring, plumbing, transit planning, alongside funding for schooling. He remembered the small arithmetic of the past, a toy car and a choice. He refused to let the institute render the poor into mere projects. It was, in its infancy, a model of the new kind of accounting Arthur had learned, that value could be measured by impact, not just profit. Arthur's children grumbled and occasionally staged small protests in the public record. Those murmurs settled like stones that never quite sank. They retained social standing and assets in minor bequests, but the center of gravity had moved. The public, always hungry for a story, found something in the tale to admire and to critique in equal measure.
For Leo, the attention was an uncomfortable lamp that highlighted a life he'd prefer to live in the careful muttering of a workroom rather than in headlines. Years folded into a life of modest change. Leo grew into the kind of man who could sign a check with a steady hand and still spend afternoons under the hood of an old truck teaching apprentices how to listen to an engine's cough. Sarah traveled less now, her shoulders relaxed of the constant tension that had marked her earlier years.
She watched as her son used the resources he'd been given not to erect a private tower, but to build bridges. Fast Eddie remained on the mantel, brass wheel catching light. Sometimes, when the house felt empty and memory heavier than air, Leo would lift the toy and run the wheel between his fingers, imagining the boy he had been and the man Arthur had tried to be. He never forgot that Arthur had staged a cruelty to reveal a truth. He never forgot either that that cruelty had led, nonetheless, to a different kind of accounting. On anniversaries of that storm, Leo would bring his mother to the study. They would sit in the velvet chair together, one on the cushion, the other on the arm, and speak quietly of small things, screws that refused to fit, the way a child's laugh could be mathematics for the heart, the odd ways people change when obliged to look at their own inventories. They spoke never of triumph in a way that sought applause. Their gratitude was private and practical, expressed in tenants housed, in stipends granted, in scholarships that allowed hands like theirs to learn. Arthur's legacy lived not merely in the transfer of property, but in the alteration of a heart that had been practiced at suspicion, and chose in the end to invest differently. He had faked sleep to test them. The test, once revealed, did not humiliate so much as instruct. The shocking outcome, what happened next, had indeed shocked him. It returned him to a currency he had forgotten counted for everything. It did not erase his past or absolve the meanness of the test. It did, however, make the account of his life more complex and more human. In time, stories condensed into a neat anecdote people repeated over dinner tables and in boardrooms as a moral puzzle. A wealthy man pretends to sleep, and a child gives away his father's toy. The man leaves everything to the child. But the truth in the telling was quieter and less tidy. It was in the ways Leo used the money to lend a hand, in Sarah's steadying, in the repaired wheel of a toy that had once been a mere child's artifact and became instead a totem of what generosity can do to harden things. The burgundy chair remained a place of memory. Sometimes Leo, now with hair flecked with the silver of years, would sit in it with Fast Eddie at his palm and think of the man who had sat there before him and learned to weep. He had been given more than funds. He'd been given a second chance by someone who, at the last, had learned how to spend not only wealth, but the currency of apology. On the mantel over the fireplace, above a tidy row of books, and beside the small brass wheel now polished by use, a simple plaque had been mounted by the Institute. A reminder, it read, that the smallest acts can reroute a life. The words were not grandiose. They were, like Leo himself, practical and plain. They were a ledger entry of a different sort, one that measured repayment in futures, not in coins.
Years later, when Leo walked through neighborhoods where the Institute had installed new heating or fixed a sagging staircase, he would sometimes see a child holding a battered toy and eyes full of the future. He would watch the small offering of a kindness in a moment where no one expected witness, and would kneel, not as a man of money, but as one who had once been offered the only thing that mattered. Arthur's portrait stayed in the study, but it ceased to be a tyrant's gaze. People visiting the library would look at the man painted in a perpetual half-smile, and then at the mantel where Fast Eddie rested, and they would, if they were honest, feel something do a small shift inside. It was not a tidy moral. It was a life lived as if someone had finally balanced an account, not by subtraction, but by a measure of what each person could do for another. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that kindness can be the most valuable inheritance of all.